Welcome to HistoPast Forward, a gentle journey through time where the past whispers its stories and the present listens in quiet awe. Relax your mind, let your thoughts drift like pages turning softly as we move forward through history, together, at a calm, unhurried pace. The darkest hours of the night would end with the first footsteps echoing in the damp silence of the stone-paved courtyards. The wind seeping through the thick stone walls would gently make the flickering candle flames dance in the rooms of this old mansion in the early morning hours. You, at those hours when the awakening had not yet occurred, were already awake. Perhaps you were barely 10 years old, but sleeplessness had become like your newborn sibling, familiar, silent, and inevitable. The first thing you put on when you woke up wasn't your boots, but the shadow of obedience. The shoe room was located at the end of the north corridor of the mansion. The stone floor leading to it would be cold. You would feel it to your bones, especially when you stepped on it barefoot. In your hands you would hold a waxed cloth, beeswax, and a brush cut from felt. These were your sacred tools of the morning. Your task was to slowly but perfectly polish and prepare the mud-caked boots of the knight and the noble lord. This was not just cleaning, this was a ritual. The way the mud was scraped off, the order in which the toe was shined, the silent patience of brushing over the seams, each of these was etched into your memory like a secret. Sometimes the shoes would still not have dried overnight, especially if a hunting party had just returned, or if a long walk had been taken outside the mansion until the end of a feast night. This mud-hardened leather would cut into your hands like a knife, but you knew, and you would not speak. For making a sound could reach the head butler's ears and turn the entire silence of the morning into a reprimand. You would simply do your work, with downcast eyes, pursed lips, and trembling fingers. The polishing process, especially for the special shoes worn by the Lord, was carried out with an almost religious devotion. Every scratch was seen as your reelessness. Every missing shine was a reason for punishment. The reason children were chosen for this work was clear: the delicacy of small hands, a patience not caught up in the haste of adults. But this was also a sign of weakness. Working bent over for hours, it would sit on your back like a stone, dulling your neck. In the longest minutes of the night, sometimes you would dream. Perhaps one day you too would have the right to wear the boots you polished. But then reality would hit you again. You were an object in this house, a nameless breath within these stone walls. That morning routine would not end with the awakening of the mansion. On the contrary, the real task would begin then. Because the shoes not only had to be clean, but also had to be neatly carried to their owners' rooms, which belonged to which floor which lord put on his right shoe first, who felt discomfort in his left heel. All of this had to be in your memory. Leaving the wrong pair in the wrong room would not only bring a scolding, but sometimes a slap. The task of carrying the shoes would be done on a small tray. Even this tray was polished. Each scratch on it was a trace of your previous mistakes. As you carried that tray, sometimes you would make eye contact with the other sleepy servants of the mansion. Some were cleaning the ashes from the fireplace, some were chopping onions for the morning soup. But there were no words between you. There was only a brotherhood in the eyes, carrying the same silence. Children like you existed in every mansion. Your name didn't matter. You were called you. Perhaps you were addressed by the name of the village where you were born. No one asked your story. Why your family sent you to this house, whose place you were working in, or how old you were, held no importance. You were just your task. And the task began with the shoes. Among the shoes, sometimes the would be special ones, Hunting shoes, ceremonial shoes, even the black boots the Lord wore on the anniversary of his death. Each had a different cleaning method. Some were not directly waxed. Some were polished with a satin cloth. Knowing this was not just experience, but also a part of survival in the mansion. Over time, your hands became covered in calluses, your fingers hardened with wax residue, but you did not speak. Because in this house, the quietest were the ones who could stay the longest. When the first rays of morning struck the courtyard stones, you would have already delivered 3 lords' shoes and be placing the 4th on the tray. As the sun rose, the night was just beginning for you. Sometimes, just as you were placing the shoes in their spot, a snoring sound from a room would mix with the ringing of a bell echoing from another floor of the mansion. At that moment you would understand that your time was not the same as anyone else's. You were a shadow. The day was beginning for others. But for you, the first act of long hours was about to close. And that morning, as you were placing the Lord's boot, you noticed mark carved into its sole for the first time. Why had you not seen it before? What symbol did it belong to? Was it just a momentary distraction, or did this mark have something deeper to say about your place in the mansion? The morning you saw the mark, there was something that subtly shook the silence within you. It looked like a small letter or symbol, almost imperceptible, carved into the sole of the boot. It looked like a curved R, but in that era, most noblemen's personal stamps were coded with symbols or crests. Perhaps this shoe belonged to another lord, or perhaps it was the shoe of a foreign guest who had recently joined the household. But you knew one thing: this boot should not have been there that morning, and this discovery began to make you think. But thinking was considered a luxury for someone like you, because the weight of a thought in the mansion could have more dangerous consequences than dropping a tray. You had to remain silent. But now, you were not just wiping away mud, you were also searching for answers. As the day progressed, the other servants had also woken up. Bread dough was being kneaded in the kitchen, chicken feathers were scattered in the courtyard, and carpets were being beaten upstairs. After completing your morning chores, you wanted to return to the shoe room to see that boot again. But the boot was no longer there. It was as if it had never existed. This small detail occupied your mind all day. When noon came, you helped set the tables for the grand feasts. Forks and knives were placed on cloth napkins, and each lord's place was carefully prepared. This task also required as much meticulousness as the shoes. A plate placed in the wrong spot would disrupt the arrangement, and then everyone would blame you. But your attention was more on the mark on the boot you had seen that morning than on this work. In the afternoon, during one of the servants' short breaks, you spoke a few words with an older apprentice. You asked him if he had brought an extra pair of shoes that morning. His eyes quickly scanned the surroundings, then he simply shook his head, saying no. Then quietly, "Sometimes someone comes, they're left before the guest arrives." This single sentence pushed you deeper, because everything in the mansion was recorded, the names of visitors, their rooms, service instructions. But this shoe was unregistered. That meant someone had either arrived secretly or had been sent secretly. That night, waiting for your turn by the fireplace, you noticed a foreign face among the other servants. He was carrying a large cloth sack, his movements nimble but cautious. He spoke to no one as he entered the room. He just went upstairs and was not seen again. Who was this person? Perhaps he was the owner of the boot. But as a child, asking questions was as risky as speaking. The next morning, when you went to the shoe room again, the fact that things were continuing as before both relieved and disappointed you. The boots were in their places. The wax box was where you had left it yesterday. But the boot with the symbol was still missing, and now you knew you would never see it again. This mystery had sparked a small flame in your inner world. Perhaps you were not just a child carrying out orders in this house. Perhaps you were someone who observed enough to truly understand some things. As time passed, these small realizations changed you. You were no longer just polishing shoes, you were reading the order of the mansion. Who entered which room and when, which lord's mood had changed, which servant's place had shifted. You began to notice all of it. Observation had become your new job, because you couldn't speak, but your eyes were the sharpest weapon within these stone walls. One day, the head butler's place was temporarily taken by another. That morning, you could distinguish his footsteps from the others. From the sound of the stone he stepped on, from the hissing breath he took as he entered. That day, he spoke too much to you. The Lord's new boots are arriving today. Be careful. That's when something stirred within you again. New boots. But you hadn't heard of a new Lord, so either someone was coming or an old one was returning. Shoes always came first, people second. This was the golden rule of the mansion. When the boots arrived, the person carrying them was silent again. But this time, you carefully examined the inside of the box. There was a new crest on the outer surface, a vine branch, and a crescent. This was the symbol of a distant family that had been newly added to the mansion. But such a name was not on the list. Another missing piece of information, another question. And these shoes, just like the boots from the previous morning, disappeared within a few days. You had become more an observer than a servant. Every footstep that fell on the stone floor was a new story for you. When a lord's walking rhythm changed, you would understand that he was ill. When you looked at the shoes of a new servant, you would guess their village. Shoes no longer shone just with cleanliness, but with information. But there were still unanswered questions. Why was that first marked boot there? Whose was it? And why did no one speak of its existence? Such small questions grew in the silence, transforming you into a different child. A regular morning was now a field of investigation for you, because your job was not just to polish, you were now reading footprints. Perhaps one day you knew these tracks would lead you somewhere else, but when that day came, you couldn't tell what question would carry you there. As days passed, the silence in the mansion began to draw you in more deeply. The shoes now carried far more information than just sounds. One morning, the first thought that wrapped around you as you stepped onto the cold stone floor wasn't how dirty the boots were, but what traces they concealed, which lord had gone where, which soil indicated which journey. These were now clear signs for you. A small piece of stone, a blade of grass in the mud, a broken stitch. All had become clues. But then something unexpected happened. The number of shoes arriving at the mansion decreased. Some lords had suddenly disappeared. Chairs were missing from the table. The servants were quieter, more anxious. You began to hear whispers in the back corridors, at the basement entrances, voices saying, "Did you hear the news?" would disappear immediately with a hush. Even the shoes were silent now. Each was cleaner and less used than it should have been. This frightened you. One night, when you woke up, you noticed movement in the courtyard. You saw the cart, which normally only carried supplies during the day, being brought in at midnight. No one noticed your eyes peering from behind your window curtain, but you saw large boxes inside the cart. And the next morning, one of those boxes was open in the shoe room. The shoes that came out of it were old, and they hadn't been polished. They looked as if they had been hastily collected, hidden there, covered in dirt, worn at the edges. Some were child-sized, These could not belong to anyone in the mansion. On the day the boxes arrived, the old head butler reappeared. He had been gone for days, but now his face was harder, his voice lower. "You're not asking anything today," he told you, looking into your eyes. "You're just doing your job." At that moment, you tried to erase your questions from your mind, but you couldn't, because those boxes carried much more than shoes. A story, a change, perhaps the end of an era in the mansion. In the following weeks, the faces of those who came to the mansion began to be less familiar. Guests smiled less, meals were prepared less often. The mansion was shrinking, and you realized that the only things that weren't shrinking were the questions. With each new pair of shoes, a new mystery arose. Who had come? Why had they left? Whose boot would never be polished again? One day in the shoe room, you found an old notebook that had fallen behind the beeswax box. Its pages were damp, the writing faded, but some words were still legible. Visitors list, secret entrance, closed doors. This notebook bore the traces of the hidden flow in the mansion. Who had written it was unknown, but it matched what you had seen. Those marked boots, missing chairs, boxes, arriving at night. Everything indicated that the mansion was not just a place of service, but also a passage, a center of secrecy. But you couldn't share these things with anyone because you were still a child. Even your name was in the shadow of someone else, but your eyes were the sharpest eyes in this stone mansion. Every piece of mud, every stitch mark, every silent step. Now they were etched into your memory, because a mind that grew in silence remembered more than a shouting crowd. Finally, that marked boot returned, but this time it was different. Brand new, polished and heavy, as if announcing its return. But this time, you didn't polish it. The head butler himself took it. You just watched. And at that moment, you understood that some shoes stain not your hands, but your eyes. Because to understand them without touching them was sometimes the way of the most silent resistance. You were no longer just a child polishing shoes. You were the carrier of the mansion's past, its silence and its shadows. Perhaps one day you would step outside these stone walls. Perhaps you would see that mark again somewhere. But until that day, all the silent traces you had gathered with your eyes would remain what made you, you. And perhaps you had recorded one of the most silent chapters of history, from the trace of that shoe that no one noticed, but where everything began. Among the least spoken of but most noticeable things in the mansion were the tapestries. Hanging on the high stone walls of the grand hall, these colourful weavings carried the stories of years, stitch by stitch. And you, a small maidservant lost among those stitches, had a task not just to clean them, but also to fold, carry and store them correctly without damage. But the tapestries were not mere pieces of cloth. They were the silent history of a mansion. Folding them was like carrying a burden of the past on your shoulders. You thought about asking Margot, but you couldn't predict her reaction. Some questions could be dangerous in the mansion, so you decided to solve it on your own. You wanted to go to the mansion's archive to examine the history of the tapestries, but servants were forbidden from entering that room. Only the head scribe and the Lord's librarian could enter. So you had to find a different way. You remembered the old notebooks kept in the cabinet behind the fireplace. You had heard that there were notes left by the masters who had hung the tapestries in their time. Late that night, after everyone was asleep, you quietly went there. You sorted through the faded, ink-blotted notebooks one by one. And finally, you found it. Winter tapestry, back right corner. Double fold stitch, rose motif. This sentence both surprised and relieved you. The mark you saw should indeed have been there. But why were these marks there? The next day's tapestry change was like another test for you. This time, a rarely used tapestry chosen for the guest rooms was to be hung. This tapestry was brought out only for rare ceremonies in the mansion's history. When you took it down and unfolded it, your eyes immediately went to the edges, and again, a mark. This time it was a complex symbol, a double-lined bow with 3 small dots beneath it. Each of these seemed to carry a different meaning. Perhaps they were letters of a language or codes of a history. A new door had opened in your mind now. Your task seemed to have changed. You were no longer just folding tapestries, but also deciphering a history. Perhaps these marks were secret notes left by the master artisans of the era when the tapestries were woven. Perhaps they were traces of an old order that passed through the mansion, or perhaps it was just a servant's attempt to make herself invisible in the fabric. Margot had started watching you calm. Eagerly, her eyes weighed your every move. It was as if she knew what you were paying attention to during the folding. One day she called you and asked, "Why are you so interested in the edges?" You remained silent. You didn't answer, and she didn't expect an answer. But from that day on, she never left you alone during tapestry work. The existence of secret marks showed you that the walls of the mansion had begun to speak in a different way. Perhaps for years, someone else had been collecting these traces in this silence. Perhaps this was a tradition, a chain of history left by silent servants to themselves, and you had started to become a link in this chain. But what was the real meaning of these marks? Were they a message, a warning, or were they just left to remember? As these questions lingered in your mind, you noticed Margot once avoiding your gaze among the shadows. Perhaps she was also part of this secret. Perhaps the answers were in her hands, just as they were in the traces of those fabrics you had folded for years. The moment Margot avoided your gaze, you felt everything change. This woman, who had quietly trained you and guided you with patience until that day, was now keeping a secret, and you were aware of it. Perhaps the marks on the tapestries were not just your curiosity, but also a part of her past. Perhaps years ago she too had noticed a mark like yours, followed it, but ultimately chosen to remain silent. Now the same question was hidden in her eyes. Would you also be silent? As you sought the answer to this question, every tapestry you folded was now like a page for you. Not fabric, but text, not thread, but lines. In every stitch, every corner fold, there was a memory, a trace, a mystery. Some tapestries had no marks, but you still checked them carefully, because now even the absence of marks was a message. Some stories perhaps had been erased instead of hidden, and perhaps that was even more frightening. One morning, Margot called you to the small storage room outside the tapestry room. "Some pieces will be moved," she said. You had never entered that room alone before. It was a small, low-ceilinged place, smelling of damp. On the shelves were rolls that hadn't been opened for years. Margot took one down, spread it on the floor, and said without looking at you, "Never fold this. This is only for storage." The tapestry was different from the others. Its colors were more faded, but its workmanship was incredibly delicate. A large symbol in its center was different from all the previous marks, an eye within a circle. 6 small stars around the eye. That symbol was on the threshold of a meaning. As Margot watched you, another detail caught your eye. On the back of the tapestry, an old piece of string was attached to the last stitch. It was like a keychain. At its end was a small button, metal, rusty, but carefully preserved. When your fingers touched it, Margot placed her hand over yours. "Sometimes, knowing the past brings a burden," she simply said. Then she rewrapped the tapestry and put it back on the shelf. From that day on, you couldn't fold the tapestries as you used to. They were no longer just fabric in your hands. Each was a carrier of another call, another memory. And you felt this weight. Margot spoke less. She gave you new tasks, but she left you alone, less with the tapestries. It was as if she didn't want you to follow the same path she had taken. But it was too late. You hadn't forgotten what you had seen. At night, as you walked in the mansion's courtyard, that eye symbol did not leave your mind. Every time you saw a tapestry hanging on the wall, you remembered that it was not just an ornament, but a way of leaving a trace. And perhaps one day, you too would leave a mark, perhaps not your initial, but a thought, a memory. You would hide it within the fabric. See, because servants did not write history, but they folded, carried, and preserved it. Months later, Margot's sudden illness accelerated everything. She could barely walk to her room now, entrusting her duties to you. One morning she handed you a small pouch. "Only open this when necessary," she said. Your eyes welled up, but you didn't speak. You didn't open the pouch that day, but you felt its weight in your palms for a long time. Whatever the secret inside, it was now yours. Finally, when Margot died, many in the mansion said no one could fill her place. But you had already taken over her duty. The tapestries were now your responsibility. You opened the first tapestry you had ever folded that day, and on its edge you embroidered a subtle mark, a very small, almost invisible symbol. It wasn't a flower, an eye, or a letter. It was simply your touch, silent but permanent. Because you were no longer merely a maidservant who folded tapestries, you were a bearer of memory, a narrator who preserved the mansion's untranscribed history, the past trapped between threads. And this task, though never spoken aloud, was silently heard within every tapestry. The warmest place in the mansion wasn't the kitchen, it was the dim room right next to it, where the firewood was piled. And you, at barely 12 years old, learnt this on your first night there. Because in the kitchen there was flame, but no room for sleep. The stove had to burn constantly, the cauldrons had to boil, and the servants' hands could never stop. But the firewood room was both warm and dark enough that no one would pay attention. And that's why all the apprentices slept there, curled up without blankets, sometimes leaning against the shadow of a log. During the day, it was just a passage. In the area right next to the large kitchen door, large logs were carried, stacked, and fed into the stoves all day long. Gee! But at night, this place transformed into the apprentice's secret refuge. Sleeping wasn't forbidden, but the lack of a formal bed indicated the uncertainty of your place in the mansion, because you were neither a full servant nor still a child. You were the shadow of the kitchen. Working in the kitchen was like being in direct contact with the pulse of the mansion. Hot water was prepared before the sun rose in the morning, bread was kneaded, meat was chopped, and soups were boiled throughout the day. The sizzling of pots, the rhythmic sounds of knives on the cutting board, the clatter of ladles against cauldrons. These were your music now. But the only place to escape this music was the firewood room. There, with the scent of smoke infused into the wood, you could close your eyes and forget your body for a short while. At first you couldn't sleep. The floor was hard, splintery wood, and the sounds of mice filled the night. But over time, your body adapted. You learned to sleep by leaving your thoughts there more than your body. In that dark corner, you learned to speak the language of a body, spending the night on the firewood that would burn in the stove in the morning. You had to wake up earlier in the mornings, because when you woke up, the firewood around you would have diminished, taken by others throughout the night, burned in the stove, turned to ash. Seeing your sleeping place vanish in the morning brought you closer to invisibility. The head chef first noticed you one such morning. He spotted you as you woke up with a piece of firewood in your hand and rushed to the kitchen. "Are you still here?" he asked. You didn't answer, because even being here was too much for you. From that moment on, you were given more tasks: chopping meat, plucking goose feathers, salting provisions for winter. These tasks helped you grow, but also wore out your body sooner. Sleeping among the logs wasn't just about not finding a place, it was also about protection, because in other corners of the kitchen among the masters, there were sometimes harsh hands, sometimes rough glances. Hiding among the logs ensured they wouldn't see you. And this was the safest darkness for a child, a darkness you chose yourself, where you preserved your own silence. One night, behind a log directly above your head, you saw an old mark. It looked like it had been carved with a penknife, not a letter, not a shape. But it was made by a human hand. Had another apprentice left it? Was it a warning or just a trace of boredom? You traced it with your fingers. It was cold, but knowing it was there, whispered that you weren't alone. Others like you had been there, shared the same shadow, spent the same night leaning against the logs. This thought offered a little comfort, and that night, for the first time, you slept deeply, because the trace of someone who had once lain there was protecting your sleep. Waking before the stove was lit in the mornings, opening your eyes while the coolness of the firewood hadn't completely dissipated. This had become routine for you, but your body was still growing, still a child's. The lack of sleep accumulated like a stone in your eyelids, but no one learned to complain, because apprenticeship began with silence. You learned with your eyes, memorized with your hands, and spoke nothing with your lips. And the firewood room was the deepest echo of this silence. Every apprentice, after spending the night there, grew a little more, became a little quieter. As work in the kitchen intensified, your place began to solidify. You were no longer just peeling potatoes. You were separating goose liver, measuring spices for soups, and sometimes trembling by the stove as you carried pots that burned your wrist. But even amidst these tasks, your mind was always in the firewood room. It was your only refuge. Sometimes, even during meal breaks, you would return there to gather a few minutes of silence, because the kitchen was like a never-ending battlefield. Everyone shouted, but you remained silent. One day, a new apprentice arrived, younger, more timid. He wasn't shown a place to sleep, but you gestured with your hand towards the logs. At first, he didn't understand. Then at night, he followed you. He knelt in the darkness and lay down on the floor. After a while, he came closer to you. "Do we always stay here?" he whispered. You nodded. He too fell silent. That's how you taught a new child to share the night, because the firewood room was not just a place to sleep, but the beginning of a silent brotherhood. Over time, this small child began to draw closer to you. He would stir in his sleep, sometimes tremble. You couldn't give him a blanket because there was none, but one night you took off the cloth apron from your back and spread it over him. You took it back before he woke up. He never noticed. But now something had changed within you. The firewood room was no longer just your refuge, but yours and his. One evening, before a grand feast, the hustle in the kitchen for preparations increased. Cauldrons boiled over, masters started shouting at each other, chaos ensued. Suddenly the hot water cauldron tipped over, and the new apprentice almost fell on it. You reflexively pulled him aside, but at the end of this action, one of the masters yelled at you, "How dare you leave your work?" At that moment, you remained silent. You didn't answer. But that night, the head chef gave you an extra piece of bread for the first time. Perhaps it was a kind of thanks, perhaps just hush money. But this small reward was like a medal in your eyes. As the nights grew longer, you had grown accustomed to the hardness of the logs even in your sleep. Even in your dreams there would be kitchen sounds, the sizzling of cauldrons, the sound of knives, the metal clink of ladles. But even in your dream, you would return to the firewood room, because it had become the summary of your life that no one knew. One night you woke up from sleep and noticed a new mark on the wall opposite you, a carved S, with fingernail marks on it. Perhaps a name, perhaps a cry for help. You traced it with your fingers, but you didn't make a sound, because now you knew every mark silently left among the logs was the unseen story of a child, and you were one of them. When winter began, the firewood room was no longer just a refuge, but a survival area. The stone walls were filled with damp, and the warmth inside the kitchen was mostly reserved for the masters. The apprentices were still outside, still in the shadow of the logs, but you were used to it now. More than that, you had come to know this space, which log stayed warm throughout the night, which had a mouse nest under it, which gap didn't let moonlight hit your face. You knew all of it. You would lift the sackcloth you folded like a pillow in the morning, then put it back in the same spot. You had become a master of order, silence and invisibility. But the order in the mansion had begun to change. New cooks had arrived, some old masters had fallen ill. The kitchen was being reshaped, and this change was reflected all the way in the firewood room. One morning, when you woke up, you noticed that the logs had been moved. Your usual corner was now given to another child. Your place was no longer there. You silently withdrew to another empty space, but this rupture had shaken the trust you had built over years. You learned that even your refuges were changeable. That day, things were tenser in the kitchen. Cooks argued, masters disliked the dishes, cauldrons constantly boiled over. New rules were set. Apprentices would now rest at specific hours. But what was called rest actually meant leaning against the wall on the stone floor. A real bed was still non-existent. That night you wanted to go to the firewood room again, but its door was locked. For the first time, it was forbidden to you, and why? Au slept, huddled in a corner of the icy kitchen, with your knees drawn to your stomach. The next day, your eyes were bloodshot, but the rhythm of the kitchen didn't stop, because within service, fatigue was not a right, but a deficiency, and you didn't want to be deficient. You worked without sleep, you held the knife incorrectly, cut your finger. No one noticed, or they did, but didn't care. For someone like you, blood was just another liquid, like melting butter, spilled soup, or rain seeping from the stone. One day you remember the old head chef quietly pulling you aside. "Years ago I too slept in the firewood room like you," he said. This sentence surprised you, because he was always a stern-voiced man who looked down on others, but at that moment the shadow in his eyes resembled yours. "Do you know that old board inside that wall?" he asked. You nodded. Someone hid a small stone under it years ago. Nothing is written on it, but everyone who held that stone one day left this place and went away. That night, you secretly lifted that board. There really was a stone underneath, small, flat, and grey, just a stone. But when you picked it up for the first time, you imagined a future outside the kitchen. Perhaps one day you could leave the mansion and sleep in a real bed somewhere else. Perhaps this stone wasn't a magical object, but the silent wish of those who came before you. And the next morning, you worked with the stone in your pocket. Your hands still had burns, your eyes were sleepless. But a silent strength had been born within you, because you were no longer alone. Many children like you had grown up carrying the weight of that stone, and this burden, instead of crushing you, lifted you up. Months later, a big change happened in the mansion. A new lord arrived, new arrangements were made, servant lists changed, and one morning they gave you news. You will now assist the external teams. You will join the unit that carries food to horse caravans. This meant going outside the mansion, crossing beyond the walls for the fee. As time, that stone was still in your pocket. And that day, for the first time, you understood where the sleeps that began in the firewood room could take you. Because you were not just a kitchen apprentice, you were a witness who grew in silence, who learned to survive by sleeping among the logs. And now you were going out to carry that testimony with your silent strength, born from a sleep, a refuge, a stone. A lord's goblet was considered as precious as his honor. Each was made with a different engraving, each had a special touch. Some were silver, some were gold-plated, sometimes adorned with precious stones inside. But more important than their exterior was how they were used. Some lords held the goblet only with their right hand. Some touched their lips to only one side. And you, as a servant, had to memorize each of these, because mixing up a goblet was considered not just an embarrassment, but an insult. Especially at grand feasts, mistakes were unforgivable. You were young when you first encountered this task. You were in the back corner of the hall, next to the servants, straightening the tablecloth. The head butler approached you and said, "Today you will only observe." He pointed to the goblets with his eye. On that huge table with golden frames, each lord had a goblet in front of him. But these were not placed randomly, each was placed according to its owner's character. Some were wide-mouthed because the lord liked to finish his drink in one gulp. Some were narrow because he preferred to drink slowly. Some only used crystal because the weight of gold suffocated his palate. That night you didn't just observe, you began to engrave into your mind which goblet belonged to whom when they picked it up, how much they drank, even where the lip prints gathered on the goblet. It was like a memory game. But this game was your survival strategy, because when morning came, the head butler called you over. "Which was Lord Martin's goblet?" he asked. You pointed with your finger. "The one with the crack on the left side." Of the logs, even in your sleep, even in your dreams, there would be kitchen sounds, the sizzling of cauldrons, the sound of knives, the metal clink of ladles. But even in your dream, you would return to the firewood room, because it had become the summary of your life that no one knew. One night, you woke up from sleep and noticed a new mark on the wall opposite you, a carved S with fingernail marks on it. Perhaps a name, perhaps a cry for help. You traced it with your fingers, but you didn't make a sound, because now you knew. Every mark silently left among the logs was the unseen story of a child. And you were one of them. When winter began, the firewood room was no longer just a refuge, but a survival area. The stone walls were filled with damp, and the warmth inside the kitchen was mostly reserved for the masters, The apprentices were still outside, still in the shadow of the logs. But you were used to it now. More than that, you had come to know this space. Which log stayed warm throughout the night, which had a mouse nest under it, which gap didn't let moonlight hit your face. You knew all of it. You would lift the sackcloth you folded like a pillow in the morning, then put it back in the same spot. You had become a master of order, silence, and invisibility. But the order in the mansion had begun to change. New cooks had arrived, some old masters had fallen ill. The kitchen was being reshaped, and this change was reflected all the way in the firewood room. One morning when you woke up, you noticed that the logs had been moved. Your usual corner was now given to another child. Your place was no longer there. You silently withdrew to another empty space. But this rupture had shaken the trust you had built over years. You learned that even your refugees were changeable. That day, things were tenser in the kitchen. Cooks argued, masters disliked the dishes, called annoyed. Rons constantly boiled over. New rules were set. Apprentices would now rest at specific hours. But what was called rest actually meant leaning against the wall on the stone floor. A real bed was still non-existent. That night, you wanted to go to the firewood room again, but its door was locked. For the first time, it was forbidden to you, and you slept, huddled in a corner of the icy kitchen, with your knees drawn to your stomach. The next day, your eyes were bloodshot. But the rhythm of the kitchen didn't stop. He smiled. Good. But you shouldn't remember the crack. Only remember its place. Because a servant memorized the owner's need, not the object's flaw. Over time, this game became harder because the number of lords increased. With each new guest, you had to memorize another goblet. Moreover, not only its shape but also its cleanliness was your responsibility. If the same goblet was given to a different lord 2 nights in a row, it was a scandal. The penalty for this could be not just a scolding, but dismissal or demotion to a lower task. And you couldn't allow that because the only way to rise in this mansion was to be perfect without being seen. The small storeroom where the goblets were kept was right behind the hall. The shelves were full, but not randomly arranged. Each stood in a velvet-lined compartment, and some had a small mark underneath. Who had put these marks there was unknown. But over time, you learned to read them too. The letter D belonged to Lord Delanor, M to Martin, and those without marks were for temporary guests. But sometimes these marks would be erased, because politics were rewritten on every goblet. One day a new lord arrived. His name was unknown, but his rank was high. You were asked to choose a special goblet for him. The head butler turned to you. You decide. This was the first time this had happened to you. You hesitate, D, but instinctively chose a long, elegantly stemmed goblet from the shelves. Its edges were silver-plated, but the inside was plain glass, neither too flashy nor too simple. That night, when the lord took the goblet, he smiled. The head butler glanced at you. It was like an approval. This small choice was one of your silent promotions. But as the nights grew longer, the task became heavier, because some lords would deliberately switch places. They would mix their goblets with another's, testing the servant's attention. Once one sat in another's place. You noticed, and during service, withdrew the goblet. "This is not yours, my lord," you said. The other lord laughed. "Look at that, how observant." But beneath that laughter was a test, and you had passed. One night, you noticed a very old engraving at the bottom of one of the goblets. Very faint, but it was there. A date was written on it, 1253. This coincided with the year before the mansion was founded. Why was this goblet still here? No one had noticed it, but you put it in a special place. On the very top shelf, in the velvet space at the edge, because some goblets were kept not just for drinking but for remembering, and you were sworn not to forget them. That night, after putting the engraved goblet aside, an indescribable uneasiness enveloped you, because now you were not just doing your duty, you felt you were touching history. This feeling was heavy. That old, dated goblet was not just a cup. It was a trace of the mansion's past, perhaps the only remnant of a story that someone wanted to be forgotten. When morning came, you checked the goblet again, but the inscription had faded even more. You carefully ran your fingers over its surface, feeling its coldness. An inner voice whispered that you shouldn't show it to anyone. As days passed, this task began to burden your mind, not just your body. Because now the goblets had not only physical but also symbolic meanings for you. The tensions between the lords could be read from the amount of wine they drank. Some would take a sip and put it back. You'd understand they were undecided or tense. Some would drink continuously and place their goblet hard on the table. They were angry. You were no longer just observing goblets, but also souls through the goblets. This was a level of information so silent it was imperceptible, yet dangerous. One day a lord dropped his goblet. It was a crystal one, with a silver engraved rim. When it shattered, everyone fell silent. Such an event was considered an omen. As servants cleaned the floor, you secretly tucked the smallest piece of the shards into your jacket pocket. This broken piece, still sharp at the edge, was a kind of reminder for you. No goblet would remain the same forever. Power, tables, wine, they could all break. After that night, the arrangement of the goblet storage changed. Some shelves were moved, some goblets disappeared. A new head butler arrived. He was more rigid. "Marking is forbidden," he said, but even without marking, you remembered, because you had measured each one's weight, the curve of its rim, the length of its stem with your fingers. Your memory was now like a shelf, storing everything in its place. The new head butler began to watch you. He knew you did your job very well, but he also noticed you were too observant. "You don't just know where to put things, but why to put them there, do you?" he asked one day. This question, for the first time, made you uneasy. Because it was true, you were no longer acting purely on duty, but on instinct. And that drew attention. One day, you were assigned the task of choosing a special goblet for a newly arrived guest lord. But this time, unbeknownst to you, someone else had been given the same task. 2 different goblets had been prepared for the same table on the same night. And of course there was confusion. The lords looked at each other, questions were asked, silence fell over the table. At the moment, you stepped in. "This goblet was not for you, my lord. It was set aside for Lord Hulwell," you said. Your words were cold but clear. You took back the second goblet and gave it to the correct person. The head butler said nothing to you that night, but in the morning he left the entire shelf arrangement to you. As the night progressed, you remembered the old engraved goblet again. You secretly returned to the storeroom. It wasn't in its place. You panicked. You checked all the shelves, but that dated goblet was gone. You only found a torn piece of cloth on it. On its inner surface, a very faint but familiar scratch. Not to be seen. This message might not have been for you, but it targeted you. You were no longer just someone doing your job, but a witness carrying the mansion's memories. And some witnesses were not wanted to know too much. That night, in the darkness of the goblet storeroom, for the first time, you felt you had transcended being just a servant. Your duty was no longer just order, but preserving memory, and this memory grew you in your silence. The silent years among the goblets had made you someone else. you now possessed a memory that not only memorized, but also felt. Before wine was poured, you knew whose it would be. You could sense the tension spreading at the table before hands trembled. From the tone of the sound made by crystal glasses, you intuited which lord would be lost in thought throughout the night. Because you were no longer just serving, but tracing, reading, remembering. The goblets were your book. Every fingerprint, every stained rim told you a story. But after the engraved goblet disappeared, you also understood that this memory came with a price. The not-to-be-seen note you found in the storeroom had kept you awake for days, because it was not just a warning, but a threat. There were limits to knowing, and you might have crossed those limits. That day, the head butler called you over. His voice was slower than usual. "There are some goblets," he said, "into which is poured not just wine, but the secret itself." Then he added, "To not remember when necessary is also a kind of service." This sentence plunged you into deep thought. Could forgetting truly be a duty? Then had all your years of attentiveness, memorization, observation, all been wrong? No, you hadn't done everything wrong, but there were some things that had to be silently buried. The games played within the goblets were like a dagger, sharper than politics. And you were now aware of this. Months passed. New lords came to the mansion. Old names disappeared. Some goblets broke, some were secretly removed. But your memory remained unchanged. You still knew who held what and how. But now you wanted to protect it, not tell it. The weight of your duty had tired you. And one day, the head butler called you again, this time with an offer. "We need someone to teach the new young apprentices the goblet arrangement," he said. This was not a promotion. This was a transfer of duty. At first you hesitated, but then you thought that others should also feel the weight of the goblets. The new child's eyes resembled yours. Silent, attentive, unquestioning, but observant. You took him to the shelves of the storeroom. "Some goblets are heavy," you said, "but their weight comes not from their contents, but from the past." The child might not have understood, but you had explained. You had now entrusted a memory to someone else. And one morning, as the mansion's winemaster was making new arrangements, he called you over. "We are separating these old goblets," he said. In the box he pointed to were a few old, worn goblets, your eyes fixed on one of them. Yes, it was it, the engraved, dated goblet that had once disappeared. You picked it up, turned it over. The date was still legible, but the carved note was gone, as if nothing had happened. Perhaps truly nothing had, or perhaps that mark had been left to put you to a test. You took that goblet and placed it on the top shelf. You wrapped a small, unmarked piece of cloth next to it, because some memories were not lived aloud, and some stories had to be left only in the right hands, to those who were silent. Like you, years later, when a newcomer to the mansion chose the same goblet, they would think how ordinary it looked. But you would know that goblet was a silent witness to an era, and as long as you didn't forget it, the past would never be entirely erased. When night fell, everyone in the mansion retired to sleep, the doors of the rooms silently closing. But your shift began at that moment. You were the head butler, and this duty was not limited to conveying orders, setting tables, or adjusting the lord's clocks. The real task began during those hours when everyone was silent. Because you did the most intimate, most invisible work in the mansion, cleaning the night pots. In dozens of rooms, the small wooden or ceramic pots right next to each lord's bed would fill up overnight and await you in the morning. This job was not talked about to anyone, but everyone knew it was done, and the one who did it had to be you, because only the trustworthy could silently share in the shame of others. The pots were varied. Some were fresh from the potter, some leaked the smell of the past from their cracks. Some lords wanted a simple bowl, some slept with a silver-plated, ornate, special night pot. But their contents were the same, the warmth of the liquid, the sharpness of the smell, sometimes even the color of the contents, would remain in your mind throughout the night. What a lord ate, how much he drank, if his health was good or if he was battling a silently decaying illness. All of this passed through your observation, but you kept your observations to yourself, because the foundation of the work was not cleaning, but forgetting. As you collected the night pots, your steps were silent, your breath controlled. If a candelabra accidentally toppled, the entire floor would wake up. But you never did that. When you opened the door a crack, faint darkness inside would greet you. You'd reach out, take the pot, and immediately close the door again. You would make no eye contact, announce your presence with no sound. There was only you and the pots, and these pots held the most fragile sides of the powerful in the mansion. Some nights were harder, especially after a feast. The lords would have drunk a lot, the pots would have overflowed, spilled, or even sometimes broken. As a head butler, you were responsible not only for cleaning but also for completely erasing this scene by morning. Leaving a trace meant doing your job incompletely. But some traces could not be erased, especially one night when you removed the pot from Lord Henswick's room. You saw dark red liquid inside. It must have been blood. But just as no one asked, you didn't ask either. You took the pot, cleaned it, and put a new one in its place. In the morning, that room was silent as usual. The Lord was still alive, but his eyes looked emptier. And you now carried another secret. Over time, these secrets began to accumulate. One lord's dysentery, another's kidney stones, also. For you, it had become a routine, not medical knowledge. The color, warmth, and sound of each pot whispered a story to you, but no one should hear these stories. One day, a young servant carried a night pot for the first time next to you. He wrinkled his nose in disgust. You looked at him. "If you can't do this job, you can't do any job, you said. Because you knew well, the quietest task within the mansion actually required the greatest trust. And during this task, you realized that the most powerful in the mansion were actually the most helpless. Those who sat on the throne by day, by night, depended on you for their pot, that smell, that liquid, that nakedness. All of it made you witness their most human, most vulnerable side. And this witnessing earned you a silent privilege, because you carried them not only with applause, but also with their shame. But one night, a pot was different from the others. It was heavier, but seemed empty inside. When you opened its lid, you only saw a tightly rolled parchment inside. There was a seal on it. It was hidden like a message that no one should see. Should you put it back? Should you deliver it? Or was it just a test? You touched the seal with your hand, but you didn't open it. You left the pot as it was. When morning came, that pot was gone, and you continued your work as if nothing had happened. But after that night, the order of some rooms in the mansion was changed. The pots were now collected in a different sequence, and you pretended not to notice, but you did not forget, because being a head butler means not just serving, but knowing how to navigate silently through time. That night, after seeing the pot full of parchment, a whole new order formed in your mind. Could the pots you collected now be not just cleaning objects, but a means of secret communication? Perhaps this task carried more than you thought, considering that you proceeded from each room in the same sequence, opening the doors at the same hours, at regular intervals, you realize that this silent routine could also be used by others. Only you had access, and this access might have made you a part of an invisible circle. In the following weeks, you began to be more careful. As you took each pot, you checked not only its contents but also its weight. Had the usual balance of the ceramic changed? Was the lid closing differently? All of this now carried meaning. One night you found a small piece of cloth tucked underneath a pot in another lord's room. The cloth was plain but looked torn at the corner, as if it had been ripped from the inside of a robe. There was no message or mark, but you were not naive enough to claim it wasn't a message. No one should know that you noticed such details during cleaning. Nevertheless, you continued your duty as head butler. But with every pot you collected, both your eyes and hands were now alert. Some nights, more than one pot came out of the same lord's room. The servants couldn't understand, but you noticed. This was a sign of more than one person staying in the room. Traces of secret conversations, late-night meetings or agreements. All of them were washed in your hands before dawn, disappearing without a trace. One morning, while cleaning a pot, you noticed a whitish sediment settled at the bottom. At first it seemed normal, but when you sniffed it, there was a sharp, bitter aroma. It wasn't familiar. You started to ask the apprentice, but decided against it. You knew that smell was not found in any food or drink in the mansion. Then you remembered a whisper you had heard years ago said that poisons were sometimes tested from night pots. Perhaps someone had left not the drink in their own glass, but someone else's fate to your duty. This realization made you even more vigilant at night. You couldn't sleep. The secret inside every pot you carried on your back now remained like a burden on your body. In the mornings your back ached, your arms tingled. But the cause of this pain was not the weight, but the silence you carried. Because you couldn't share what you saw with anyone, you could only tell yourself what you experienced. One night, in a pot you took from one of the oldest lord's rooms, you noticed letters carved under the lid. RSV. A small, thin, barely discernible carving. That lord was no longer alive. But that pot was still in use. Should you erase the carving or protect it? You couldn't decide. That night the door remained closed. You didn't enter the room. In the morning, the head butler was waiting for you in his room. "Why didn't you enter the room?" he asked. "The pot was in place, but you didn't take it." "Why?" Al remained silent. Then you said, "Because it hadn't been entered." This was a lie, but it was as powerful as the truth. As nights passed, you felt more and more a part of the old order. The pots no longer carried just shame, but information. No one thanked you, no one praised you, but sometimes, in the gaze of a maidservant, sometimes a master, there was a silence you recognized. They knew too. Being a head butler meant not only being the manager of the quietest hours, but also the bearer of the oldest secrets in the mansion, and you had learned to walk tall with the weight of this secret. Now, every pot you held in your hand at night was not just a duty, but a test. For an outsider, it was merely the cleaning of filth, ensuring the mansion's hygiene. But you knew that each pot was a reflection of the power relations, decaying reputations, ailing bodies, and hidden games within the mansion. Every liquid carried was a word unspoken, and you heard it all. Silently, without objection, no less, no more. When that day came, the morning the Lord suddenly fell ill and retired to his room for an unknown reason, you had already noticed a different smell in his night pot. Sharp, but herbaceous. Not poison, perhaps, but a disturbing mixture. You had been thinking about it all night. Who had put it there? Were you the only one who noticed this? And more importantly, if you spoke, would the balance of the system that valued your silence be disrupted? But you remained silent. As always. You just emptied the pot, washed it, and put it back. This time, your fingers trembled. It was something you weren't accustomed to while performing your duty. For the first time, your body couldn't remain as silent as your mind, because the burden was no longer information, but conscience. And this was much heavier. Late at night, as you walked through the long corridors, you heard the echo of your footsteps more sharply. Because you knew you weren't alone, someone must have been watching you. Perhaps one of the new head butler candidates, or one of the internal auditors with eyes very aware. But whoever it was, the information you carried could now be a danger in their eyes. Therefore, that night, you didn't look at any of the pots you collected. You carried them, cleaned them, arranged them on the shelves. You separated the task from emotion, making it an ordinary job again. In the morning, one of the old librarians of the mansion called you. You go through the same rooms in the same order every night, he said. Do you know this mansion has run like this for 100 years, the same cycle, the same secrecy, the same silence. But every century, someone emerges who does their duty not only with their hands, but also with their eyes. He looked into your eyes. You are that someone. These words were neither a threat nor praise, just a reminder. A sentence that told you that you had now left a trace. And that night, you tucked a small piece of paper into the bottom of one of the last pots you collected. There was no writing on it, just a crumpled blank space. Perhaps someone who saw it would assign it a meaning. Perhaps no one would notice, but for the first time, you had left your own mark. This was your silent rebellion. Months passed. The order in the mansion did not change. The pots continued to fill, and you continued to collect them. But the thoughts that passed through your mind no longer suffocated you, because you had accepted that you were not the one doing the heaviest work in the mansion, but the one who knew the most. Duty passed not through shame, but through knowledge, and you were the sole carrier of that knowledge. Finally, one night, you gave a small, quiet piece of advice to the newest apprentice. What comes into your hand is not just a pot. Sometimes it's a secret. But remember, you must be the only one to carry it. The child might not have understood, but with those words you had lightened your own burden a little. Cause silence sometimes lightens not by carrying, but by handing over, and you had finally learned this. Mending socks from the outside seemed like one of the smallest tasks in the mansion. A needle, some thread, a few stitches. But this work was part of a silent struggle that took place behind the walls at night, because feet were what were most affected by the cold stone floors, the damp rooms, the harsh winters. And feet were like forces that silently wore down stones. The only thing protecting them were those thin wool socks. Your job was to notice and repair every weakening spot in that protective layer. But you weren't using an ordinary needle. There was only one silver needle given to you by the mansion's old tailor. This needle works slowly, but leaves the right mark, she had said when giving it to you. And with that needle, you had started mending not just socks, but your life. The first night when you picked up the needle, you even struggled to thread it. Your fingers were chapped from the cold, the thread was thin. But the sock in front of you was not just a piece of clothing. Its heel was worn through, its toe punctured. How many stairs had the lord or lady who wore it climbed? How many steps had they descended? How many strides had they taken lost in thought throughout the day? All of this was hidden between the threads. As you unraveled those threads, it was as if you were unraveling the story of that day. Over time, you would know which sock belonged to whom by its texture. Those made of fine wool usually belonged to the ladies. The stiff, thick ones were for kitchen staff or those working outside. But the ones you really had to pay attention to were the nobleman's socks, because they didn't just expect repair, they wanted to be reshaped, repaired almost invisibly. If the stitch line was too prominent, you would be scolded. If there was a bulge where you patched, a note would arrive in the morning, "Servant forgot her work." And you, throughout the night, would re-sew, inserting the silver tip of the needle more carefully. As years passed, the silver needle became accustomed to your hand. You now threaded it in one go, folding the thread according to the width of the holes, but this mastery came at a cost. Your eyes gradually began to blur. Mending in the night light, working in shadows with candle flame, these tired your eyes, turning into headaches over time. But you didn't stop, because in the mansion, the first things to be overlooked were not the socks, but those who mended them, and the best way to remain invisible was to do your job flawlessly. One day, while mending a sock, you noticed a small knot inside. It wasn't made of thread. It was as if something had been stitched between the fabric. You carefully unpicked it, and a tiny piece of paper fell out. On it, only a single letter was written: E. Was this just a mark, or a message? Whose sock was it? Which room had it come from? That night, before re-sewing the sock, you thought for a long time. You put the paper back. You left the letter as it was. And for the first time, you knowingly sealed the trace of a secret passing through a mend. That small piece of paper with the letter E made your hands tremble all night. You had mended hundreds of socks before, but nothing like this had ever come out of one. This was the first moment where your work intersected with someone else's secret. That night, as you sent the sock back, you left a tiny pattern with your needle right in the middle of the mend you had made. A stitch made with the silver needle, so fine that it could only be seen when the light hit it just right. 3 small crossed lines. If someone saw it, they would understand. If that sock came back, perhaps there would be a response to this mark. When the next night came, exactly 7 socks were brought to you. 5 were ordinary, the same thick thread, the same crushed heels, but the 6th was familiar, the same fabric, the same texture, the same tiny protrusion. And your mark was still there. But this time the mend was torn, and a new piece of paper was tucked inside the sock. It was embroidered with a pattern that was barely discernible. When you took out the paper, this time it wasn't just a letter. There were 3 words: "He's still watching." Your heart raced. This could no longer be just a game. Someone had recognized your hand. They were speaking to you through the sock. For the first time, before completing the mend, you began to think about the order of the rooms, the direction the socks came from, because now you wanted to know where the thread was going, who it was touching. But such questions were not asked in the mansion. Only hands worked, lips remained sealed. So you didn't ask either. Still, you paid close attention. Perhaps you would catch a glance, perhaps a hand gesture. But nothing happened, just socks came again and again. A while later you found another different mark in another mend. This time there was no paper, but an extra thread had been passed under the sock, in the heel area. The direction of the stitch was different. This wasn't amateurish, it was done intentionally. When you unpicked this stitch, a metal wire came out. Very thin, finger-sized, resembling a needle, but without a sharp point. It had no weight, but it had a purpose. Whose it was, why it was there, you didn't know. But there was no doubt now. Your silver needle and this piece had somehow crossed paths. That night, for the first time in years, you wanted to put down your needle. You placed it on the table and just looked at it. This small silver piece had taught you to mend dozens of holes, but now it seemed to be pulling you into another hole, a void where silence deepened. Because now you were not just mending, you were also digging beneath the mend. Yet you had started this work to be invisible, but the invisible were always the ones who saw the most. The next day, the new girl in the tailor's room approached you. "Is this your needle?" she asked. She held a needle very similar to yours, but not silver. You looked closely at her face. In a soft voice you said, "Mine is colder." At that moment your eyes met, and this was a moment of recognition. Perhaps she knew something too. Perhaps you two were on opposite ends of the same silence. But neither of you spoke. You just returned, guiding your hands to the stitching, because in the mansion, secrets were not spoken, they were stitched, and sometimes the tightest stitches told more than words. As nights passed, the thread you worked with also began to change. What was once ordinary wool thread had now almost become a reminder. Every stitch, every loop, took the place of a whisper. The socks carried not only worn feet, but also unspoken things. And you, every night, silently read these voiceless letters. The behavior of the new girl had also changed. She spoke less, secretly watching the socks you mended. Sometimes you noticed small asymmetries in her stitches too. Seemingly random, but actually deliberate curls, imperceptible thickenings. This was a sign of another language. Perhaps she, like you, had been silenced. Perhaps these stitches were the letters of a secret alphabet created between the two of you. One night, as socks were being distributed to the rooms in the mansion, you secretly returned, not to get the spool of thread you had forgotten in the tailor's room, because that was just an excuse, but to open the drawer of that small table waiting for you there. What you found on the new girl's table was not just a cut piece of fabric. A chill ran through you when you saw the letters stitched into the edge of the fabric. 4 letters. Lux. You didn't know what it meant, but you had seen these letters before in the crest weaving of another mansion. Perhaps that girl had come from somewhere else. Perhaps she had been sent here for something or someone. Perhaps your needle had been chosen because it left not only mends, but also traces. That night you intentionally left an extra thread in one of the socks, a thick and shiny blue thread. It was impossible not to notice when you returned in the morning that sock was missing, but you saw that same blue thread had returned along the stitching of another sock that had been put in its place. But this time it was bent into the shape of a letter, D. This felt like an answer to you, but you no longer knew which question the answer was given to. You had to be careful. The next week, an unexpected fire broke out in the mansion. Small but noticeable, it had started near the tailor's room. Fabrics were damaged, some shelves collapsed, but no one was injured. The incident was recorded as a short circuit, but you knew you lived in a house that ran on threads, not electricity. This was a warning. Perhaps every mark stitched had been noticed by an eye, and someone in the mansion wanted to silence this silent conversation. After the fire, you couldn't find your silver needle. It wasn't where you had left it on the table. You searched, but it was gone. The new girl was also missing. She was never seen again after that day. No letter, no news, no trace. Only absence remained, and for the first time that night, you tried to mend the socks with a bare needle, but no stitch held. The thread slipped, your hands trembled, your eyes welled up. The silver needle had made you not just a mender, but a seer. When you lost it, not just a tool, but a path had gone from your hand. And then one morning that needle fell out from among the old fabrics, as if it had returned to you, but now it was something else. Slightly scratched, its tip slightly bent. But when you saw it, you understood every trace, every bend, every notch was part of an untold story. And you were the one who had stitched all these stories, unseen, unquestioned, unspoken. That day, you made your last stitch. The sock was old, but you worked to the mend so that no one passing by could fail to notice it. No on. He would know what you wrote inside. But one day, perhaps someone, by the direction of the thread, by the trace of the silver needle, would understand you. And then, this silent history would begin to speak again. The grand hall was the heart of the mansion, where stone walls rose, long tables were set, the laughter of knights and lords echoed, orders were given, and decisions were made. But one detail in the very centre of this hall was the source of an invisible fear among the servants, the long red velvet-covered bell cord hanging from the ceiling. At first glance it was harmless, even majestic, but this cord would descend like a command, and echo like a punishment. Because when that cord was pulled, the footmen had to rush. If they didn't run, if they were delayed, if a plate was knocked over, if a goblet swayed, at the end of that night, a footman's name could be erased from the list. The first time you entered that hall, your eyes met that cord. Hanging high, it was coiled like a snake, waiting to move. The clapper at the end of the cord hung down to the side of the table. Sometimes a lord would reach out and pull it without even getting up from his chair. And at that moment, footsteps would come from a small door at the back. Not one, but sometimes 3 footmen would rush in at once. Because no one was ever called alone, the command was never clear. Sometimes water, sometimes a message, sometimes a scolding. Being a footman required being the most invisible, yet the fastest in the mansion. You were a presence in everyone's shadow, never in front of anyone, but always waiting nearby. You held your breath, lowered your eyes, but kept your ears open. Because a few seconds before the bell cord was pulled, the silence would change, an eyebrow would raise, a plate would be pushed. This was the silent precursor announcing the cord's call. The first time that cord was pulled, you froze. The other footmen dashed off, but you couldn't move. Your heart had risen to your throat, because the sound of the cord vibrated not just the bell, but also you. That night, you were reprimanded. If you don't run, you won't be a footman, they said. He who stands still cannot stand up. This sentence kept you awake. You walked on the tips of your toes until morning, because now you knew. When the cord was pulled, you had to feel it first, not just hear it. Some footmen had learned to sense that cord. They would anticipate when it would be pulled from which end of the table. They taught you this too. If Lord Velen tilts his head to the right, he'll pull it 3 breaths later, they said. If Lady Arliss tosses her hair back, that's a silent call. You took notes, not in your mind, but in your body. Now your muscles tensed before the cord was pulled. Your steps were ready to be taken without even looking at the hall. But still, some calls would catch you unprepared. The bell would ring at such a moment that there would be a silence throughout the hall. Even the running footman wouldn't know where to go. Because sometimes the call wasn't a service, but a punishment. You run, but only to be scolded. You were late, they'd say. You made eye contact, they'd say. Yet you had only reacted the moment you heard the cord. But in this job, it wasn't time that mattered, but being a shadow. And you still couldn't be a shadow. The bell cord reminded you of this difference every night. The bell cord was not just a calling device, it was the voice of the invisible hierarchy in the mansion, and sometimes the echo of a threat. All sorts of rumors circulated among the footmen about this cord. Once, a child footman who heard the cord late had his room cleared out the next morning, another was sent to the kitchen after running in the wrong direction, and another for accidentally looking into a lord's eyes while standing at the end of the cord was never allowed into the hall again, and these stories would circulate like whispers among the hands carrying water in the mornings, mixing into the soup cauldron at dinner, and boiling anew. Over time, you learned to live in the shadow of that cord. Your eyes no longer followed the goblets on the table, but the position of hands, the duration of a finger in the air, the touch of a thumb on a wine bottle, the fold of a napkin. All were pre-indicators of a call, and you, from these signs, would start to step into the hall seconds before another cord was pulled. But this speed brought no praise, because a footman's goal was not just to be fast, but to remain invisible. If you went too early, you showed yourself. If you were too late, you not only were late, but also shamed the other footman. Balance was everything. The bell cord sometimes wouldn't be pulled all day, but every time you stepped into that hall, you felt it was there, hanging from the ceiling, motionless but alert. When you glanced at it, it wouldn't move, but as your steps approached it, it seemed to tremble slightly. Sometimes a breeze would touch it, sometimes only in your imagination. But this feeling would follow you even into your sleep at night. In your dreams, sometimes that cord would reach out to you, catching you. Sometimes you would hold the end of the cord but couldn't find the courage to wring it. You would wake up drenched in sweat, and in the morning you would remember that you had to enter the hall again. One day, when that cord was pulled, someone else ran with you. A new footman, younger than you, more anxious. He stumbled and fell. The hall fell silent. One of the lords in a harsh voice said, "Pull yourself together." But no one helped. You turned back, reached out your hand. The child looked at you, fear and surprise in his eyes. You helped him, he got up. But from that moment on, they kept an eye on you. Because in this job, not just silent service, but emotionless loyalty was expected. And that night, you had crossed a line. The next morning, they didn't call for you. The bell cord was pulled, but your name wasn't heard. Someone else ran, someone else served. From among the old fabrics, as if it had returned to you. But now it was something else. Slightly scratched, its tip slightly bent. But when you saw it, you understood. Every trace, every bend, every notch was part of an untold story, and you were the one who had stitched all these stories, unseen, unquestioned, unspoken. That day, you made your last stitch. The sock was old, but you worked the mend so that no one passing by could fail to notice it. No one would know what you wrote inside. But one day, perhaps someone, by the direction of the thread, by the trace of the silver needle, would understand you. And then this silent history would begin to speak again. The grand hall was the heart of the mansion, where stone walls rose, long tables were set, the laughter of knights and lords echoed, orders were given, and decisions were made. But one detail in the very center of this hall was the source of an invisible fear among the servants. The long, red velvet-covered bell cord hanging from the ceiling. At first glance it was harmless, even majestic, but this cord would descend like a command, and echo like a punishment. Because when that cord was pulled, the footmen had to rush. If they didn't run, if they were delayed, If a plate was knocked over, if a goblet swayed, at the end of that night, a footman's name could be erased from the list. The first time you entered that hall, your eyes met that cord. Hanging high, it was coiled like a snake, waiting to move. The clapper at the end of the cord hung down to the side of the table. Sometimes a lord would reach out and pull it without even getting up from his chair. And at that moment, footsteps would come from a small door at the back. Not one, but sometimes 3 footmen would rush in at once, because no one was ever called alone. The command was never clear. Sometimes water, sometimes a message, sometimes a scolding. Being a footman required being the most invisible, yet the fastest in the mansion. You were a presence in everyone's shadow, never in front of anyone, but always waiting nearby. You held your breath, lowered your eyes, but kept your ears open, because a few seconds before the bell cord was pulled, the silence would change, an eyebrow would raise, a plate would be pushed. This was the silent precursor announcing the cord's call. The first time that cord was pulled, you froze. The other footman dashed off, but you couldn't move. Your heart had risen to your throat, because the sound of the cord vibrated not just the bell, but also you. You sat outside the kitchen on an empty barrel, wondering why that child still wouldn't leave your sight. Was being a footman not just about steps, but about conscience? Or was every act of mercy in the mansion considered a deficiency? The bell cord remained silent for you that day, but now you knew that cord did not just give orders, it also measured a person against themselves, and in that measure you had failed to remain invisible. But perhaps being seen, at times, was as human as being afraid. After that silent day, when they took you back to the hall, you were no longer your old self. Although you were one of the footmen running to the bell cord, the initial fear within you had been replaced by something else, the feeling of being noticed. You used to want to be invisible, but now you knew that your every step might be watched. Not the Lord's eyes, but the silent judgment of the other servants enveloped you, especially the head butler, who now watched you more carefully. He said nothing, but he wrote your name in his notebook at the same time every day, as if he was measuring your movement before the cord was pulled. As the bell cord was pulled, you ran again, but now with every call you were more measured, neither too early or too late. Neither conspicuously fast, nor too cautious to be late. This balance made you invisible again, but you knew that this invisibility was the result of a silence earned. That child, the fallen footman, was no longer there. He had been replaced by another face continuing his duty. He bore the same name, wore the same uniform, but his eyes looked much emptier. Perhaps he blamed you. Perhaps he just couldn't see himself in the mirror anymore. But you, every night as you swept the spot where he fell, felt that the stones beneath your feet still remembered that fall. One day, a grand feast arrived. Foreign lords were guests at the mansion. The hall was filled with lights. Music echoed. But the cord, it was still there. In the quietest corner of the ceiling it hung as always. In the middle of the night it was pulled once more. This time the call was different, because the cord trembled twice. This rarely happened. 2 pulls usually meant a special command or a special punishment. You ran. When you arrived in the hall with the other footman, the old lord at the end of the table pointed at you. You? The one who helped, he said. A bit slow, but loyal. You will serve me tonight. No one objected. Perhaps this was a reward, or the end of a test. Throughout that night you only stood behind him. You held his goblet, gave him his napkin, draped a blanket over his shoulders, but at the same time you wondered, was this a choice? Or had the eyes watching you made their decision about you? In the morning you returned among the footmen, but every time you entered the hall you felt as if that cord was waiting for you even without calling you. And then one day the cord broke. No one could explain how. No servant dropped it, nor did anyone pull it too hard. The cord was simply found on the floor in the morning. Its velvet fabric was slightly torn, its clasp broken. The end of the chain hanging from the ceiling height was swaying. This event was talked about for days. The head butler had a new cord installed, but it was never like the first one. Bessie was that first cord had been a symbol that had silently reigned within the mansion for years. You secretly took a piece of the old cord. You cut a small piece from the edge of the velvet and put it in your pocket as a memory of your own fear and silence, because that cord had trained you. It had taught you invisibility, courage, the limit of speed, and the penalty of slowness. Now it was gone, but you remained, and you were no longer just a footman, but a walking extension of the silent power in the mansion. The bell cord would perhaps now be pulled by other hands, but even if you never heard its sound again, you would remain among those who did not forget that sound, because fear was an unforgettable teacher, and you were its quietest student. The stable was the quietest but most active place outside the mansion. The breath of horses, the sound of hooves, the rustling of straw. Though these sounds might seem like a harmonious order from the outside when viewed from within, each belonged to an identity called by a different name. When you first stepped into that stable, you were only tasked with sweeping straw. But soon after, you were given a list, the names of the horses, which lords they belonged to, when they were fed, and when they drank water. When you held that list in your hand, you felt the weight of the letters. Because these names were not just animal names, each was a nobleman's pride, each a carrier of a battle, a journey, a memory. Memorizing the horses' names was a task that had to be etched not only into your memory, but also into your heart, because bringing the wrong horse to the wrong lord was not just a mistake, but a humiliation, and you were barely 13 years old. The first name you learned was Solvay, a large grey stallion, Lord Merrick's horse. He was fed only carrots in the morning and kept in the shade during the day. When Solvay's name was pronounced, you now recognized him without thinking, because names were now remembered not by sound, but by mane, by the sound of hooves, by nasal breathing. By the second week, the number of names had exceeded 20. Some lords named their horses after their own daughters, some after a companion from an old battle. Some horses were called by two names, one official, one secret. Only you and the horse's owner knew the secret one. When called by that name, they would prick their ears more carefully. When you learned this, you understood that horses were also bearers of secrets. But memorizing names wasn't the end of the job. Beneath every name was a temperament, and beneath every temperament was a detail. Trover would stumble when stepping on his left front foot. Ellerin would only become restive if approached from his back right side. Taking notes of these details was forbidden. You had to keep them in your mind. And keeping them in your mind wasn't enough. You had to show it with your actions too, because you were no longer just a stable boy, but a shadow who had learned the language of animals. One day, a new lord arrived. He brought two horses with him, but didn't give their names. He just said, feed them in the morning, walk them in the evening. But within 2 days you understood the hierarchy between those horses, from their glances at each other, their breathing speed, and their walking stride. The larger one protected the smaller one, and the smaller one silently leaned on him. You gave them names in your own mind, Frost and Shadow. No one knew those names, but when you called them that morning, they turned their eyes to you. Because sometimes, more than knowing a name, you had to learn the language to which it would respond. Each new day meant a new horse and a new memory, and your mind was now like a straw-scented notebook. Its pages were silent but full. Only those who knew how to read it could understand. But your job was not to write, but to remember. Every name, every sound, every step was etched in your mind, because to forget a horse's name meant to leave that animal nameless, and nothing nameless could exist in the mansion. As time passed, the stable became not just a workplace for you, but also a memory test. You had to learn not only the horses' names, but also how those names should be spoken. Some horses would become agitated when they heard their names in a harsh voice, while others expected a soft tone. The name Volmir had to be pronounced with an echo, because he was a horse raised in distant hills. Yera, however, had to be whispered. Her ears were sensitive, not used to loud sounds. As you noticed these nuances, you realized that this task actually required a kind of silent musical talent. Each name carried its own melody, and you would repeat those melodies in your mind every morning before the sound of hammers. With each new lord, the list grew, but no one gave you paper anymore, because what was expected of you was no longer just memorization. It was to not forget, not to err, not to be surprised, and to intuit. Your mind was a memory archive triggered with the first light of morning. As your fingers swept the straw, your eyes distinguished the main line of each horse, your ears separated the sound of hooves on the stone floor. One day, a visiting knight lost his horse. As you searched for it with the other servants, you knew which side it lay on just by the smell of its droppings, because for you, even the smell of each horse was a kind of signature. But so much information, so much burden, began to tire your mind over time. Even in your dreams at night, horse names repeated: Solveig, Trova, Eleran, Ayaz, Golga, Volmir, Yera, and more. Sometimes these names would get mixed up, sometimes they would form new names that never existed. When you woke up, a horse's name would be on the tip of your tongue, but you wouldn't remember who it belonged to. This forgetfulness frightened you, because one day, if you said a name wrong, all trust could be shattered. One morning, Lord Merrick's horse disappeared. You were held responsible, because you were the one who knew his name best and recognized his behavior best. Everyone claimed you had whispered his name wrong that morning, yet you had whispered his name, but the horse hadn't responded, because that night his chain had been untied and he had gone outside. He was later found unharmed, but that day it wasn't your ability to remember that was questioned, but your loyalty. This hurt you deeply, because your memory was stronger than a chain, but when the chain broke, the blame was placed on memory. It was from that moment on that you realized you carried not just the names, but the responsibility for those names. Now, with every step, there was a burden. With every call, a test. And you accepted this, because in this task you started as an apprentice. You had become not just someone who received orders, but a silent sage, a bearer of memory. Even if no one remembered your name, thanks to you, dozens of horses had not forgotten theirs. This thought kept you going. But a fear grew within you. What if you truly forgot one day? Forgetting, for you, would mean not just a mistake, but a loss of identity. Because you were no longer just a stable boy, You were the equine memory of a mansion. That morning, as you tried to remember the name that lingered on the tip of your tongue when you woke up, the panic inside you surged in waves, because that name had wandered in your dreams all night, followed you, but had been erased in the morning light. You washed your face, put on your boots, stepped into the straw-scented courtyard. But the horse whose name you had forgotten was waiting for you. It recognized you with its eyes, turned to you, wagged its tail, and at that moment you understood that your memory lived not only in words but also in movements. The name was a tool, but the bond was established in silent agreements. Lords changed, guests came and went. Some wanted to look after their horses with you, but then they withdrew, because the animals knew you and you knew them. And this mutual trust was stronger than external orders. Now your memory was not just names, but the reflection of the characters those names carried. One day a young knight couldn't recognize his own horse. You, however, distinguished it simply by the thin white line on its tail. The knight applauded you, but you bowed your head. Because for you, this was just duty. It wasn't about being praised, but about remembering. But as years passed, you noticed that the horses' names changed, their owners changed, but you remained. New apprentices came. You tried to make them memorize the names, but most just took notes. Few were like you, etching into memory, learning with care. Some confused the horses' faces, some forgot the morning feeding time. At first you were angry, then you accepted it. Time was now asking another task of you. One night you decided to rewrite your old list. You found paper, sat by candlelight, and wrote the names one by one. Solveig, Eleran, Trova, Yera, Volmir. As you wrote each name, your eyes filled with tears, because most of those horses were no longer in the stable. Some had been sold, some had died, some had been moved. But for you, they were all still there, in the shadow of the wall, in the curl of the straw, in the reflection of the water bucket. One morning, the old stableman came with a message in his hand. They called you to the small room behind the great hall. The head of the mansion had deemed a new task suitable for you. You were no longer an apprentice. You would be the head stableman. Every new horse that arrived would first pass through your eyes and would be accepted after your approval. That day you understood that a memory not only carries information, it also builds trust. These names you had carried for years had turned into the strength that would carry you. And when night fell, you sat aside and looked at the stars. Silently you whispered softly, "Frost, shadow, Solveig." Perhaps their hoofbeats were no longer in the stable, but in your memory. Each one still lived, and you knew as long as someone remembered a name, no living thing was truly lost. When preparations for the feast began, everyone's steps in the kitchen would quicken. Thick chunks of meat were chopped, pots began to bubble, and the sound of hot oil filled the rooms. But for you, amidst this activity, the same rule always applied. Tasting the food was forbidden. Even though you were a cook, no flavor you prepared should touch your lips, because a servant's palate in the mansion could not be trusted. Tasting belonged only to the lords, sometimes to the head butler. You only prepared. You measured the caramelized onions on low heat with your eye and understood the inside of the meat from its smell. You had become skilled enough to hear from the sound of the mixture whether there was too much salt. When you first started, this prohibition seemed unbelievable to you. How could a cook prepare food without tasting it? But the master chef, fixing his gaze on you, simply said, "The tongue makes mistakes, but the eye does not forget." From that day on, you too learned to cook with your eyes, to read the signal given by the color, to memorize the bubbles on the surface, to feel the density of a dish just by stirring it. This was not an art but a necessity, because in that kitchen, taking a spoon to your lips could make you lose everything. Once a new apprentice, out of curiosity, tasted the soup. No one saw him, but you did. When your eyes met, you saw both fear and hunger in his eyes, because with just one spoonful he had both broken a rule and suppressed his curiosity. But that evening, if you had been in his place, what would you have done? This thought occupied you for days, because sometimes you too, when the scent of soup hit your face, wanted to forget everything for a moment, but you couldn't, because for you, tasting the food was not just breaking a rule, but also breaking an honor. When the day of the feast arrived, everyone in the kitchen fell silent. Only the sounds of pots and ovens remained. Everyone spoke with their heads, racing against time. You, however, prepared the most important dish. The consistency of its sauce was adjusted by eye, its spices first spread in the air by hand, then mixed into the dish. You couldn't taste it, but you knew if it was ready by its smell, your eyes, your wrists. Your heart tightened as you placed the food on the large platter, because each time the fear of what if it's lacking gnawed at you. But the dish not returning, empty plates arriving with praise, was like a silent approval. Your reward, not just crumbs, but complaints that never came back. The applause from the feast hall was an echo of praise you couldn't hear, because you were at that moment in the back of the kitchen, sorting empty plates, making the final checks for the next dish. Even a piece of meat or a trace of sauce left on a plate told you a lot. Which dish was liked, which was pushed aside, which lord ate more, which one didn't even touch his plate. You continued to cook by reading these signs. This was a form of silent communication. To be able to understand without needing their words, but still, for you, every meal was like a blind fight, sensing the other with feelings but never being able to hear directly. One night, a special meal was prepared for a feast held after a grand knight's tournament. New spices had been used, saffron from Morocco, lemon zest from Sicily, and very rare white garlic. You had never tasted these ingredients, but had memorized dozens of recipes and used them countless times. When preparing the dish, you had to rely not only on he recipe, but also on your senses. The entire kitchen watched you, because this dish would be your masterpiece. But still, you wouldn't be able to taste it. Your hands trembled, sweat ran down your wrists, because to make such a rare and expensive dish flawlessly, knowledge alone was not enough. Blind trust was also needed. During cooking, you hesitated for a moment. The consistency of the sauce seemed slightly watery. Normally, you would check with a spoon, but this time an urge rose within you. Just a fingertip. No one will notice. You reached out your finger, but stopped, because an inner voice pulled you back. Years of silence, the master's words, the kitchen's silent discipline stopped you. In the end, you used your eye, not the spoon. When you placed the dish on the plate, you took a slight, deep breath and just waited. The food was taken to the hall. Silence. Then the sound of forks, then whispers, then a single sentence from afar. Let wine be offered to whose hand this is. That wine did not come to you, because you were still in the back kitchen. But that sentence was a reward for you. That night you still didn't taste the food, but you had felt what it was like. Your tongue was silent, but your heart had spoken. But a small curiosity still lingered within you. Had it really turned out as it should have? That night, when you were alone in the kitchen, even the last drops in the large cauldrons had cooled. Even the crumbs on the counter were neatly arranged now. Everyone had long since retired to their beds, but you were still awake. In your hand, an old wooden spoon, in your eyes, the soot stains on the ceiling, and in your mind still the same question: was the food really right? No one would give you the answer to this question because tasting was forbidden to you. Yet food left a trace not only in the stomach but also in memory. And your memory roamed among the dishes you had never tasted. Every recipe revolved in your mind like a shadow. Every spice scent clung to another memory. Your mastery lived not in your palate, but in your remembrance. As years passed, new apprentices came. Some, on their first day, smeared sauce on their mouth, then were caught. Some whispered to you secretly, "Master, what if I just take one little taste?" But you just shook your head, because the first secret of this profession was patience, and patience was best learned when hungry. Sometimes, while collecting crumbs after a feast, a piece of meat would fall before your eyes. Your eyes would imagine its flavor, but your hands would not touch it, because in this kitchen, willpower was the most valuable taste. One day, the mansion's old head chef retired. As they discussed who would replace him, all eyes turned to you. No one asked you, how was his dessert, nor which dish do you make best. But everyone looked into your eyes, because for years you had been cooking not by tasting, but by not tasting. And this was the greatest devotion in the kitchen. When they declared you a master, there was no applause. Just a silence rose from within the kitchen, just like you, an unseen, unheard, but always present appreciation. Even after becoming a master, the rules did not change. Tasting was still forbidden. But now every dish that came from your hands was seen as a testament. Flavor had become a silent affirmation. And you began to be known in the mansion as the one who knew the most without ever tasting. Perhaps no one offered you wine, perhaps you never received applause, but one day a young servant came to you and quietly asked, "Master, is this dish bitter?" You just smiled at him and said, "Your eyes will tell you that." At that moment you understood that the sense of taste did not have to be a cook's identity, because some flavors were only cooked with patience, loyalty, and silence, and you made that flavor felt in every bite. Before your first watch, the weight of the notebook given to you came not just from its pages, but from the rules it contained. The pages were yellow, their corners curled, each written in black ink, and they contained a total of 83 articles. One does not look directly into the Lord's eyes. The guest passes through the door first. No shadow is cast. Each seemed to have been written as the result of an error committed over years. And now you were tasked with preventing the repetition of these errors. Even before the duty began, you had to memorize them, because to be a master servant was to learn to exist without being seen. Rules were the formula for invisibility. For the first few days, you didn't let go of the notebook. During meals, while one eye was on the steam of the soup, the other followed the lines. Before sleeping, you looked at the last page, and as soon as you woke up, you repeated the first rule. Each rule was not just a behavior, but a way of thinking. For example, the rule, "Laughter is forbidden after 5 o'clock," had surprised you. Then you learned that this coincided with the Lord's hour of silent walking. Not even laughter, but footsteps were forbidden at those times, and you, over time, began to understand not only how to remain silent, but which silence took precedence over another. By the 52nd rule, you were no longer just memorizing the rules, you were living them. You were forming secret sentences between the rules to communicate even with a glance among the servants. If a guest drops their cloak, fold it instead of hanging it. This rule was about the guest's rank, because some valued only folded cloaks. When you first noticed this distinction, you had grown another step, because now you saw not only what was written but also what was unwritten. But when you came to the 75th rule, you struggled. When serving the lady of the mansion, one does not look in the mirror. This made you think. The mirror, while a tool for self-checking, was forbidden here. Then the master servant told you, a servant looks not at the mirror, but at the order of the mansion. And at that moment you understood that service was not just physical labor, but also the art of setting aside oneself. You were no longer just learning the rules, you were hiding your own existence within the rules. This watch was not just a night, it was a way of life. And you had already started to think 83 times before taking your first step. Living within the rules was sometimes harder than understanding them, because you were now responsible not just for the lines you memorized, but for moving in their shadow. As the night of your first watch approached, those 83 articles lined up page by page in your mind, repeated like breaths, not just commands. Candlelight is not to be held with the left hand, said the 37th rule, because the right hand had to remain free for defense at all times. No one had told you this directly, but you, while carrying candles in the dining hall, understood why that rule existed in the face of a lord's sudden movement. Rules were not just behavior, but a defense system, and serving sometimes included protecting oneself from danger. On the night your watch began, everyone was already asleep. Even the footsteps echoing on the stone floor of the hall had a certain rhythm. Every corner, every wall, every shadow corresponded to a rule in your memory. One never turns their back at the point where two walls meet, said Article 79, because those corners were places loved by silent eyes. Being watched was easier than making a sound. As you walked, you carefully scanned these corners, moving silently within the shadows. You were no longer just watching, you were listening. The crack in the stone, the extinguishing of a candle, the creak of a door. Each guided you. In the middle of the watch, the silence was broken. A faint sound of glass breaking from a distant room made you move. One of the rules immediately came to mind. When you hear a sound, first look at the window, not the door. Because sometimes danger comes not from outside but from within. When you turned to the window, you saw a silver pitcher knocked over by a cat inside. The rule had protected you, but more importantly, you had applied it without thinking. This showed that the rules had now become an instinct for you, not an external obligation. When the watch ended at the end of the night for the first time, you sat on the courtyard stones before dawn. Your feet ached, but your mind was in a strange peace. The rules hadn't suffocated you. On the contrary, they had given you the security of being part of an order. But a question bothered you. What would you do if one day you encountered a new situation, and that situation didn't fit any rule? When the moment came to make a decision of your own, beyond the rules, how would you abandon them? There was no answer to this question, but you fell asleep thinking of only one article throughout the night. If you are unsure, do not move at all. But what if the moment you shouldn't have moved was actually the right moment that would change your life? Over time, just as the rules shaped you, you began to question the limits of the rules. You now knew every article by heart, and even in the silence of the night, you could calculate which step corresponded to which rule. But one night, in the corridor leading to the old lady's room, you encountered something outside the rules. A trembling breath, a dim light, an open curtain. One does not approach a guest's room without permission, said Article 48. But this was not a guest. The old lady had fallen from her bed, lying motionless on the floor. The rules were silent here. Now you had to make a choice. You ran without hesitation. The rule, "Do not touch without permission," echoed behind your shoulder, but you carried her, laid her in her room, and pulled her covers over her. Then the doctor was called. In the morning, you were sure this action would punish you, but it didn't. On the contrary, the head of the mansion called you and asked, "Which rule guided you?" You answered, "None." This answer silenced everyone in the hall. But the head servant nodded and said, "That is why there is no longer any need to teach you new rules." From that day on, you became not just a rule enforcer, but the bearer of the spirit of the rules. When new servants extended their notebooks to you, you were no longer telling them the lines but the spaces between them, because you knew that the real knowledge lay within what was unwritten. Rule 63, never speak first. But sometimes you began to speak without being asked, because now you could stand beyond the rules without overflowing their boundaries. This was not a rebellion, this was a maturity. Years later, the pages of the notebook had faded, the ink blurred. But in your memory, every article was still alive. Until one day, a young servant came and asked, "Master, what do you do if a rule seems wrong to you?" You lowered your eyes slightly and softly replied, "Rules tell of time, but if a person surpasses time, they must write a new silence." At that moment, the young servant closed his notebook without asking anything else, because he now understood some watches begin with rules but are completed with conscience. And even though you had memorized 83 rules before your first watch, life had taught you to write the 84th from within yourself. Serving wine was considered one of the quietest but most careful tasks for a servant at the table. The hand should not tremble while carrying the goblet. The liquid should not spill. But most importantly, no eye contact should be made, because making eye contact with the lords was considered an indiscretion in the mansion's order. A servant would not look, they would see, but pretend not to. This delicacy was not just behavior, but a world view. The first time you stepped into the grand dining hall with a wine carafe, even the stones beneath your feet were quieter than you. This was the first thing you were taught. Don't look, listen. Don't see, sense. Whenever a goblet was extended, you would lower your eyes, but your mind was aloft. Was there an expression on the Lord's face? Was his hand trembling? Did he extend the glass fully? To notice these things, not eyes, but attention, was needed. For the first few nights, this was difficult for you. Trying to understand what someone was feeling without looking into their eyes was like reading a silent book aloud. But over time, the absence of eye contact made you more attentive. The curve of the Lord's lips, the tilt of his shoulder, the way he held the glass, these became signs, because for you, etiquette had now become the language of a silent agreement. Since you made no eye contact, no one greeted you, no one thanked you. But if the wine was poured on time, the satisfaction on their faces was your reward. One night, a guest whispered to a servant, "Why don't you look at me?" The young servant was bewildered, but you quietly approached and took the carafe. Your eyes were still downcast, but your demeanor was clear. Then you silently moved away, because at that moment it was understood. Looking was not a courtesy, but a boundary, and you were the one who protected that boundary. But curiosity gnawed at you. If a servant's face never remained in anyone's memory, could that person truly be said to have existed? As nights chased each other, your hands became more skilled, but your eyes turned more inward. Now, under the dim lights of the hall, you were carrying not just the wine carafe, but the weight of a ritual. Behind every step, every pour, there were retraces of a centuries-old tradition. The lords sat at the same table, but rarely made eye contact even with each other. And you, like a silent shadow gliding among them, became the bearer of this silence. Over time, you noticed that wine was not just a drink. It was a symbol of power, authority, and remembrance. But you, while presenting all these, had to make your own existence invisible, because the more invisible you were, the more flawless your work was considered. One day, there was an argument in the hall. As the verbal tension between two lords grew, you were right in the middle of it, a wine carafe in your hands, your head bowed, your eyes fixed on the floor. But your ears caught every word, your body felt every tension. At that moment you learned that avoiding eye contact was not just respect. Sometimes it could also be a life-saving shield, because when you didn't look, they considered you not to have seen, and someone who didn't see couldn't target you. After that argument, no one asked you what you felt. A servant had no feelings, it was said. But you couldn't sleep that night. The coldness of that carafe was still in your hands. Only one thought kept revolving in your mind. If one day someone looked into your eyes and tried to understand who you were, what would your answer be? Because for years, with every pour of wine, you had hidden your face. And now you were left with a question. Was a service offered with a hidden face truly your own work, or were you just a reflection of the rules? As time passed, you became skilled at distinguishing the sounds of the hall, the flicker of candles and the subtleties in the sound of wine being poured. They no longer needed to tell you to avoid eye contact, because this had become your nature. When you saw a hand raise a glass, you instinctively extended the carafe, turned your face slightly, pouring the liquid with it, without spilling or making a sound. This movement had become so internalized that you were now remembered not by your presence, but by your absence. Everyone saw you, but didn't remember you. You had worn this absence, been shaped by it, matured with it. But one night, an unexpected question arose from within this invisibility. Why have you never looked at me? A guest asked this question. You had your eyes down, filling wine, standing directly opposite him. He, however, had been watching you. You showed me respect with your service, but your eyes never touched me, he said. You didn't answer, because an answer required something beyond the rules. That night, for the first time, you looked into a stranger's eyes, a brief, silent moment. But in that gaze there was a past, a longing, perhaps an apology. The guest averted his eyes, and you bowed your head and walked away. But what passed through your mind at that moment was this: I wonder how much other truth have I missed by ignoring it for years. After that night, some things didn't change. You still poured the wine silently. You still kept your eyes on the floor. But now, with every pour, you remembered yourself too. This had become not just someone else's rule, but your preference, because serving wine without making eye contact was not just respect, but part of the art of forgetting oneself. But you now knew the difference between forgetting and ceasing to exist. And thanks to this difference, you would be remembered not as an unseen person, but as a master of silence. Even if your face was unknown, your hands, your steps, and your silence had left a trace on this table. The scent of lavender was a constant presence in the mansion's corridors, a necessity no one questioned. When you were first sent to the laundry room as a servant, this detail seemed insignificant to you. Why should every shirt, every tablecloth, even every linen undergarment worn at night smell of lavender? But over time, you understood that this was not just about cleanliness. It was the bienzo, a scent of order, of nobility, of distinction. Because lavender was not merely a pleasant fragrance, it erased the traces of the past, stamping an invisible hierarchy onto every fabric. If a lord's collar lacked that scent, it was either the servant's mistake or a crack in the mansion's reputation. In the laundry room, lavender water was prepared in a special ratio. Neither too much nor too little was used. Too much lavender would be conspicuous, too little would be impolite. You worked with your fingertips as you learned this ratio. You watched the buds disperse in the hot water, listened to how silks softened with steam. Then you learned that lavender not only smelled good, but also repelled insects and prevented the spread of diseases. This is why all the mansion's laundry was washed with lavender, even in summer. Illness was stopped with scent before it reached the door. But the real issue was how the scent represented the mansion, because an outsider, before dinner, would notice the smell of the tablecloth. If there was lavender, there was order and care. If not, disrespect began. You learned this one day when guests arrived, and in a hurry some cloths were hung to dry. The guest lady wrinkled her nose. She said nothing at that moment, but that night the head housekeeper came down to the laundry room where you were. There was no smell, she simply said, and from that moment on you began to prepare the lavender buds by crushing them with your own hands every time, because the absence of the scent was not just a mistake, but a deficiency, an invisible deficiency that everyone felt. As days chased weeks and weeks months, lavender in your hands became much more than a scent. You could now sense how lavender would disperse in different atmospheres and how long it would linger on certain fabrics. The scent evaporated faster from cotton cloths but seemed to permeate silks. Each fabric carried lavender in its own way. Every piece hung on the clothesline was like a silent greeting, a greeting reaching guests, lords, and even the cooks preparing food in the kitchen. You were no longer just cleaning, you were playing with the mansion's reputation, because even the absence of a scent could be enough to sicken a lord's stomach or shake a guest's respect for the mansion. One day, before winter set in, the annual Grand Laundry Day was announced. This was the day when everything in the mansion, from pillows to curtains, would be thoroughly washed and scented anew. That morning you were woken up early. Cauldrons were set up in the courtyard, lavender water boiled in large copper pots. The steam burned your eyes, but you did not flinch, because this day was the servant's own silent day of triumph. You were now the protagonist of a story told through scents. When the fabrics were hung, the wind carried the lavender to every corner of the mansion. Even the passing lords involuntarily took deep breaths. No praise came at that moment, but you realized silent satisfaction was the truest honor. But that night, when you returned to the laundry room, you noticed something, a small piece of cloth stuck in the corner. It hadn't been washed or scented. It was a servant child's sleeping cloth. Unnoticed, you picked it up, washed it with your own hands, dried it, and sprinkled lavender water on it. Because you had learned that not only the lords valued the scent. The essence of service was hidden in the most invisible detail, and you considered it your duty to offer lavender not only to noble shirts, but also to a small child's night. That night, as you slept, you noticed the scent of lavender on your nose. It had transferred from your hands, and that scent whispered to you, sometimes a mansion was respected not for its cleanliness, but for the hands that sea-salt arid its scent. But you kept asking yourself, if one day the lavender ran out, would the mansion's reputation also fly away with it? During the day, You swept the brightly polished halls, subtly wiping away dust that fell beneath the chandeliers. But at night, you had no bed of your own. While the other senior servants had separate quarters and the kitchen masters had their warm corners, you would open the door of a closet every night and curl up among the folded sheets inside. However temporary it seemed, this eventually turned into a ritual. Sleeping among the sheets was something that covered you not with a blanket, but with the heart of the mansion. The silence there was deep. The fabrics were old, but soft. Each had been washed, folded, and touched by others' bodies dozens of times. But for you, this wear was not a deficiency, but a comfort. The first night you hid in this closet, the door to the grand hall had closed outside. The servants had retired, the candles extinguished, leaving only the coolness of the stone floor and the creaks in the wall. As you shivered, you touched the edge of a linen sheet hanging from the shelf and instinctively pulled it over you. You don't remember how much time passed, but that night you slept your deepest sleep. When the head housekeeper found you in the morning, she said nothing. You didn't even make eye contact. But that day the sheets placed in the closet were folded more neatly than before, as if a space had been made for you. This closet had now become your sanctuary. Even if you were scolded during the day, even if there was little food, even if you failed at a task, returning there at night gave you a sense of absolution. After tending to others every day and forgetting your own name, you rediscovered your own body in that closet. Among the folded sheets you left not only your fatigue but also your existence, waking up with the same silence in the morning. But one day you couldn't help but ask yourself, if one day these sheets changed, if the closet became empty, where would you sleep? As nights chased each other, the order in the closet also began to live with you. Every fold passed through your hands, every sheet carried a trace of you. Every piece you folded acted like a pillow, preparing you for the night again. During the day you took dozens of steps and listened to dozens of orders. But only at night, when you entered between the sheets, you didn't have to say anything. Silence had become your language. The scent of fabric inside the closet, dust mixed with soap, perhaps a little lavender, was now the call of your sleep. There was no one snoring there, no one turning on the light in the middle of the night. There was only you and the fabrics that had been washed thousands of times with you, whose wrinkles were memorized and who had become friends with time. But spending every night like this was not easy. Especially when winter nights came, the coldness of the stone walls also enveloped the inside of the closet. No matter how thick the sheets were, they couldn't warm you like a blanket. You would wrap the sheets more tightly, tuck a towel between your legs, trying not to get cold. Sometimes a mouse would pass outside. Sometimes creaks from the servants' kitchen would interrupt your sleep. But you were still content to be there, because no other place belonged to you, neither a corner in the courtyard, nor a chest in the kitchen, nor a bunk in the dormitory. Only that closet, and the folded silence within that closet. One morning the head housekeeper opened the closet door and found you inside. At that moment you didn't know what to do, but she just looked for a long time, then gently closed the closet. From that day on, no one asked you about this habit. But a pillow appeared on the bottom shelf of the closet, waiting for you every night. A pillow whose name no one had written, but everyone knew was yours. And now every night you went there, not just to sleep, but to be accepted. But one night you dreamt someone was collecting the sheets in the closet, emptying the closet. When you woke up, your breath was rapid. At that moment you thought, a place does not belong to a person until someone takes it from you. What if the closet was given to someone else one day? One day in the middle of winter, news from outside the mansion caused a major clean-up to begin. The prince was coming. During his stay, every room would be rearranged, every fabric renewed, all sheets changed. This news was like a warning that made everyone, from the highest ranks to the lowest apprentice, hold their breath. You, meanwhile, secretly wondered about the fate of the closet. It was no longer just a place where sheets were stored. It had carried your nights, your fears, your peace, and your name. And now that closet would be rearranged by the hand of the head housekeeper. When that day came, the closet door was left open. The shelves were emptied one by one, old fabrics were thrown into a basket, and newly woven cloths were placed inside. The inside of the closet looked cleaner, more organized, but the warmth that had accepted you was gone now. For a few nights you tried sleeping in different corners, in the deserted kitchen, behind the woodshed, under the stairs. But no place embraced you, no place forgot you like the closet. Everywhere there was either a noise or an eye. You wanted to be invisible, but now you couldn't disappear anywheres. Finally, late one night you opened the closet door again. You didn't go in among the newly placed sheets. You just stood inside for a brief moment, smelled, touched. And then you gently closed the door, because your place was no longer there. Your body had grown. Your duty within the mansion had changed. You were now given bigger tasks during the day, but at night you still couldn't belong anywhere. That old closet was now just a storage room, a shelving system, an object in someone else's eyes. But inside you, it was still a sanctuary. One day a young servant came to you and whispered, "Master, I can't find a place to sleep." Your eyes looked at him, your hands slowly pointed to the closet door. As that child entered in the silence of the night, you moved away. That closet now belonged to someone else, but you knew that some sheets covered not only bodies, but also tired souls, and some closets would continue to silently protect a child's world